The dog stopped dead in the middle of a hospital hallway and refused to move. Not slowed down, not hesitated, stopped. 70 pounds of trained military muscle, a Belgian Malinois, who had survived 3 combat deployments without flinching once, planted all 4 paws on the linoleum floor and locked his eyes on a nurse nobody in that building had ever bothered to look at twice. His handler, a decorated Navy SEAL who had walked through burning buildings and called it Tuesday, stood frozen behind him, watching his dog tremble. Not from fear, from recognition. And when the nurse knelt down and whispered a word, one single classified word that existed in no public record, no civilian database, no file that anyone outside a sealed military operation had ever touched, the SEAL's throat closed. Because that word was the dog's battlefield name, and nobody alive was supposed to know it. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about people the world forgot too soon, people who carried more than anyone knew, and the moments when the truth finally refuses to stay buried. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Redwood Harbor got 3 inches of rain before 7 a.m. was the same morning Navy SEAL Captain Declan Marsh walked into Callaway Veterans Medical Center with a retired Belgian Malinois on a short lead and a burned photograph folded twice inside his jacket pocket. He had not slept. The drive from the naval base took 4 hours, and he'd made it in 3 and change, which was the kind of decision a man makes when he's been carrying something for 7 years and has finally run out of patience for carrying it quietly. The dog's name, the name Declan used now, the civilian name the handlers gave him, after his service papers cleared, was Bravo, 81 pounds. Sable coat, a 2-inch scar running along his left shoulder from a piece of shrapnel nobody fully explained in the incident report. Bravo had been through 3 deployments, 2 field surgeries, and 1 extraction that had no official name because the operation it belonged to had been quietly reclassified into a drawer somewhere no one opened anymore. Bravo walked fine in public. Crowds didn't bother him. Loud noises had stopped bothering him after the 2nd year of civilian life. He was, by every trainer's standard, a remarkably stable retired working dog, which was why what happened in the hallway of Callaway Veterans Medical Center made Declan Marsh stop breathing for a full 4 seconds. The emergency wing was busy. It was always busy, a fact that the hospital administration liked to ignore in the monthly reports they filed with the state. Nurses moved fast down the main corridor, clipboards and tablets in hand, sidestepping gurneys and IV stands, and the occasional family member standing too close to the center of the floor because they didn't know where else to stand. The overhead lights in the East Wing had been flickering for 3 weeks. Someone had filed a work order. Nobody had come. Declan came in through the side entrance. The way the intake coordinator had told him to Bravo was a certified therapy support animal now. His vest said so. But hospital front desk still got nervous about dogs anywhere near the main lobby, so side entrance it was. He signed in. He got his visitor badge. He was supposed to meet with the head of the Veterans Support Program on the 2nd floor. He never made it to the 2nd floor. They were 40 feet into the East Wing corridor when Bravo locked up. No growl. No alert bark. The dog simply stopped moving and stood there, and the lead in Declan's hand went bar tight, and Declan almost walked into him before he registered what was happening. Bravo. Low, even. Command voice. The kind that was so deeply wired into both of them that it bypassed everything else. Heel. Bravo didn't heel. Declan looked up to see what the dog was watching. Corridor was a normal corridor. Nurses. A supply cart. A man in a visitor's lanyard standing by a water fountain. A woman in blue scrubs crouching next to a gurney, adjusting the IV line on an elderly patient with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had done that specific motion approximately 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. She wasn't remarkable. That was the thing. She was precisely the kind of person a crowded hallway made invisible medium height, dark hair pulled back, no makeup, the kind of tired that wasn't dramatic, but had just become a feature of her face. Her badge was clipped to her front pocket. Her hands moved carefully. Bravo took 1 step forward, then another. Declan held the lead. Bravo. Heel. The dog turned his head and looked up at Declan, and there was something in that look. Something Declan did not have clinical language for, but had lived with long enough to read, and then Bravo turned back towards the nurse and took another step. Declan let him go. He didn't know why. 7 years of military discipline, and he let the dog go because something in his chest told him to, which was not a reason that would hold up in any briefing room he'd ever stood in. But it was what he had. Bravo crossed the corridor in 12 careful steps and stopped 3 feet from the nurse. He sat. And then, and this was the part that Declan would replay, for a long time afterward, the dog made a sound. Low. Not a whine exactly. Something between a whine and the sound a dog makes when it's been a long time, and it finally recognizes something it thought it lost. Still. She had been reaching for the IV stand. Her hand stopped mid-motion. Her shoulders dropped, not relaxed, the opposite of relaxed. The way a body drops when something unexpected hits the back of the sternum, and she turned her head slowly. She looked at the dog for a long moment, and then she reached out one hand, palm up, the way you extend a hand to a dog you know, not a dog you're meeting. And Bravo pressed his nose into her palm and closed his eyes. Declan crossed the corridor. She heard him coming. He could tell by the way. Her spine straightened half a second before she looked up. The way someone does when they're used to monitoring space around them. Old habit. The kind that doesn't come from nursing school. He doesn't do that, Declan said. His voice came out lower than he planned. He doesn't do that with people he doesn't know. The nurse looked at him. Her eyes were dark, level, and gave away nothing, except the fact that they were very good at giving away nothing. Dogs are unpredictable, she said. Not this one. A pause. She stood up slowly, which gave Declan his first clear look at her right hand, the way it moved. Or more precisely, the way it didn't move all the way. 2 fingers on the right hand not fully extending when she let go of the IV stand, a limitation so practiced she'd built her entire grip around it. He filed that away, without knowing why. I should get back to my patient, she said. What's his name? Declan asked. She blinked. The patient? The dog. He watched her face. What do you think his name is? Something shifted. It was fast, and she controlled it fast. But Declan had spent 11 years in environments where reading a face in low light from 50 meters was a survival skill, and he didn't miss it. A flicker. There and gone. I have no idea, she said. I've never seen this dog before in my life. Her name badge read N. Varas. Run. He found out her first name from the duty roster. It took him approximately 6 minutes. One conversation with a talkative orderly named Pete, who was very proud of his knowledge of the nursing schedule, and 0 actual deception. Her name was Nadia Varas. Used 7 years at Callaway Veterans Medical Center. Charge nurse on the East Wing. Described by Pete as quiet, keeps to herself, scary good at the trauma stuff. Nobody really knows much about her. Declan sat in the family waiting room on the first floor, Bravo beside him, and he looked at the burned photograph. He'd had it since the morning after the extraction. Found it in his jacket pocket when he woke up in the field hospital, and he had no clear memory of how it got there or where it came from. It was mostly destroyed. Fire had taken most of the right side, and the edges were carbon black and brittle. But there was a face in it. Part of a face. The left side, from jaw to temple, a woman. Dark hair, in gear that didn't match any standard issue he'd ever been able to identify. No insignia visible. No name. He'd spent 2 years running that partial face through every database contact he had. Nothing. What he did have was a voice. A voice in his ear during 43 minutes of an extraction that had gone comprehensively wrong, saying things like, "Stay with me and I have you," and "Don't move that arm," and once, very quietly. Something that wasn't an order and wasn't exactly comfort, but was the specific kind of thing a person says when they need you to stay conscious and they're running out of standard options. He had Bravo, who had been with him through that extraction and had come out of it with the shrapnel scar, and a revised behavioral profile in his military file that his handlers could not fully explain. And he had one word. One word. The woman's voice had used a word that wasn't standard call sign protocol, wasn't in any field manual, a word that existed in exactly one place. The moment she said it to the dog in a burning structure, in a country Declan was not technically supposed to be in. He needed to hear Nadia Varas say that word. He went back to the East Wing. He found her at the nurse's station, typing a chart update, and she saw him coming this time and had an extra 2 seconds to make her face completely blank. Captain Marsh. She said it like she'd looked up his visitor badge. "You know my rank. It's on your lanyard." She gestured without looking up. Most visitor badges don't list military rank. Most visitor coordinators don't ask for it. He sat down across from the station. I asked them to add it because I'm here on a support program inquiry and wanted to be upfront about my background. The badge just says Declan Marsh. No rank. Nadia's typing did not slow down. Then I made an assumption. Based on what? Your posture. He leaned forward slightly. You've been around enough military personnel to read posture. I've worked in a veterans medical center for 7 years, she said. You build pattern recognition. It was a good answer. Logical, clean, completely plausible. He didn't believe a word of it. Bravo knows you, he said. Bravo, my dog. You named your dog Bravo. His handlers named him. I kept it. She finally stopped typing and looked at him. And there it was again, that quality of stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from control. Captain, I'm in the middle of a shift. I have 6 patients on this wing and a medication round in 20 minutes. I don't know your dog. I don't know you. And I genuinely don't know what you're looking for, but I'm not it. Operation Iron Corridor, Declan said. The stillness became something else. Just for a second. The air between them changed density. I don't know what that is, she said. It was classified, he said. Still is, technically, which is part of the problem. 7 years ago. Extraction gone wrong. One of our team medics disappeared from the record. Afterward, no discharge papers, no injury report filed under her name, no forwarding personnel file. She just stopped existing. That's unfortunate, Nadia said flatly. But it's not something I can help you with. The medic saved my life, Declan said, and the lives of 2 other operators. And she went back for the dog. Something in Nadia's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. She went back into a burning structure for an 80-pound working dog that everyone else had already written off, Declan continued. Carried him out. She carried me out. She held a pressure dressing on a femoral bleed for 43 minutes in smoke, so thick I couldn't see her face. And then she was gone. The file was altered. Her name was removed. And I have spent 7 years trying to find out who she was. Nadia looked at him for a long time. Her expression was the expression of someone who had decided a very long time ago what they were and were not willing to carry in public, and who was not about to renegotiate that decision in a hospital hallway. I'm sorry about what happened to you, she said. I'm sorry you can't find the answers you're looking for, but I am a floor nurse at Callaway Veterans Medical Center, and I have a shift to finish. She picked up a chart and walked away. Bravo watched her go. The dog tracked her down the hallway with the focused, unblinking attention he used to reserve for personnel, confirmed friendly in a hot zone, and Declan watched him do it, and he thought about the word. He was still thinking about it when the voice came from behind him. You need to stop. Declan turned. The man standing at the nurse's station had not been there 30 seconds ago. He'd appeared the way hospital administrators appeared, materializing from side corridors and staff elevators, moving with the confident ownership of someone who considered the building an extension of himself. Late 50s, silver hair, white coat over a suit jacket, which was a choice that said physician but meant executive. His name badge, Dr. Reed Callum, MD Chief of Trauma Services. Dr. Callum, Declan said. Whatever conversation you just had with my nurse, it ends now. Callum's voice was controlled, professional, and carried the precise warmth of someone who had decided before he walked over that warmth was not the appropriate tool for this situation. Callaway has a strict policy on patient and staff interactions with outside visitors, including military personnel. You're here on a support program inquiry. That's the extent of your access. I was having a conversation. You were questioning a member of my staff about classified military matters, which is outside the scope of your visit and which visibly distressed her. Declan looked down the corridor. Nadia Varas was moving efficiently between rooms, not distressed or not visibly distressed, which was not the same thing. He was beginning to understand, and she had not looked back. She seemed fine, Declan said. She is fine, because she is a professional, Callum said. Nurse Varas has a history that makes certain interactions, particularly military-related inquiries, inappropriately stressful. She has disclosed that to her supervisors in confidence. And I am asking you, as the department head responsible for her well-being, to leave her alone. What history? Declan asked. That's between her and her supervisors. Callum straightened. I'd like you to complete your intake meeting on the 2nd floor and keep your interactions within the approved program scope. If you have trouble with that, I'll need to ask security to assist you. Declan looked at the man. There was something off about it. Not the protectiveness that could be genuine. Administrator, protected staff. It happened. but the speed. The fact that Callum had appeared within minutes of a conversation that had taken place in a side corridor at a nurse's station, which meant either someone had told him immediately or he had been watching. And the way he'd framed it, history that makes military interactions stressful. That wasn't a supervisor protecting a nurse. That was a man with a file, using that file. Of course, Declan said. He smiled. It was the smile he used in briefings when he needed the room to think he was agreeable. I'll head upstairs now. He picked up Bravo's lead. He took 3 steps toward the elevator. Then Bravo turned his head back down the East Wing corridor, toward the last place he'd seen the nurse, and made that sound again. Declan stopped. He stood with his hand on the elevator call button and his dog facing the wrong direction, and he made a decision. He did not press the button. He found a chair in the East Wing family alcove, a small, recessed waiting area with 4 chairs, a fake plant, and a clear sightline to the nursing station, and he sat down. Bravo settled at his feet. Declan pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first call was to his commanding officer's adjutant, who told him what he already knew. Operation Iron Corridor was still classified, and the personnel files associated with it were sealed pending review by a board that had been pending for 6 years. The second call was to a contact in Naval Personnel Records, who told him, after a long pause, that a file marked under that operations code prefix had been consolidated 7 years ago, which was bureaucratic language for something that meant the opposite of what it said. Third call was to a former field medic he trusted, who listened to his description: female combat nurse, special operations attachment, right hand injury, disappeared from record after an extraction, and said quietly, "You want to be careful, Declan. Some of those consolidations happen because someone wanted them to happen, not because of oversight." He was on his 4th call when the East Wing went loud. It didn't build gradually. It went from the low, functional noise of a working hospital floor to controlled emergency in about 4 seconds. A rapid overhead chime, the specific one that meant trauma inbound, and then voices, staff voices, clipped and direct, and then a gurney coming fast through the corridor from the ambulance bay. Declan stood. The patient on the gurney was a man, late 40s, military bearing visible even unconscious, oxygen mask on, blood pressure cuff already attached. Paramedics were talking fast, handing off to the trauma team blast exposure, approximate, secondary survey incomplete, pressure dropping, and the trauma team was moving. And Nadia Varas was already there. She had come from 2 rooms down, and she hadn't run. Nurses who ran in emergency wings tended to create secondary panic, which was why the good ones moved at a speed that was very fast, but looked controlled, and she was pulling on gloves and reading the paramedic handoff at the same time, eyes tracking the patient's vitals on the portable monitor. Dr. Callum arrived from the opposite direction 30 seconds later. He looked at the patient. He looked at the team. He looked at Nadia. "Take primary," he said. "BP's at 70/40 and dropping," Nadia said. "Breathing pattern is off. Listen to the left side. I have the patient, Nurse Varas. His left lung is compromised. That's not blast trauma presentation. I said I have the patient." Callum moved past her. "Get the crash cart prepped and step back." Nadia's jaw was tight. She did not step back. She stood at the edge of the circle and watched, and her hands were still, and her eyes were doing something that Declan recognized. They were running calculations. The kind of calculations that had nothing to do with hospital protocol and everything to do with a much older, harder-learned discipline. Patient's monitor alarmed. Callum called for epi, Nadia said, clearly. Not loudly, with the flat certainty of someone stating a physical law. That's a tension pneumothorax. Epi won't fix it. He needs needle decompression right now. Second intercostal space. You're out of your scope, Nurse Varas. He is going to arrest in the next 90 seconds if you don't decompress that chest. The room went briefly, electrically silent, and then the patient's monitor flatlined. Declan was moving before he made the decision to move, which was also an old habit, crossing from the alcove to the corridor doorway, with Bravo tight at his side. And he could see through the open trauma room door, Callum reaching for the defibrillator, Nadia already moving to the patient's left side with a needle in her hand, 2 of them on a collision course over a dying man's chest, and then Callum's hand came out and gripped her arm. Step back. Nadia looked at him. Something in her face had changed. Controlled stillness was still there, but underneath it something else had surfaced, something that had been waiting a long time, something that was not anger exactly, but was the thing that comes after anger has been compressed for years and years until it stops being emotional and becomes structural. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at the patient. She looked at Callum. And she stepped forward anyway. She stepped forward anyway, and Callum's grip tightened on her arm. And for one long second, the trauma room held its breath. Then Nadia did something that surprised everyone in the room, including Declan, who was watching from the doorway and thought he'd stopped being surprised by people years ago. She didn't pull. She didn't argue. She simply turned her body at an angle, a small economical rotation that used his grip as a pivot point rather than an obstacle, and her left hand came up with the needle already positioned, and she placed it at the second intercostal space on the patient's left side with the kind of accuracy that has no relationship to luck. A rush of air. The monitor screamed, dipped, and then the line came back. Not clean, not strong, but back. The room moved. 2 nurses and a resident converged on the patient with the automatic efficiency of people who had been waiting for direction and had just received it from an unexpected source. Callum released Nadia's arm. He didn't say anything. He stood at the edge of the controlled scramble and watched his trauma team work around the intervention she had just performed. And his face was the face of a man absorbing something he intended to address later, in a room with a closed door. Nadia stepped back once the team had control. She stripped her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin by the door, and when she turned and saw Declan standing in the corridor, she didn't startle. She looked at him for exactly 1 second and then looked away, and that single second told him more than an hour of conversation had. She had known he was there. She had known, and she had stepped forward anyway. He thought about that while the trauma team stabilized the patient. And Callum withdrew to the corridor to make a phone call with his back turned, voice low enough that Declan could only catch fragments. Unacceptable. Outside scope, liability exposure and Bravo sat at Declan's feet and watched the trauma room door with the patient attention of a dog who was not going anywhere. The shift change happened at 7 p.m., and Declan was still in the building. He had gone upstairs at 4:30 and sat through 40 minutes of a support program intake meeting with a program coordinator named Voss, who was enthusiastic and well-meaning and deeply unaware that Declan's mind was 3 floors down in an East Wing corridor. He answered Voss's questions. He nodded at the right intervals. He filled out the forms Voss slid across the desk, and when Voss asked him to come back on Thursday for the orientation session, Declan said he would. He came back downstairs at 6:15. Nadia was at the nurse's station writing discharge note, and she registered his presence the way she seemed to register everything, without turning her head, without breaking stride, just a small recalibration in her posture that said, "I know you're there." "Still here," she said. Program meeting ran long. She didn't look up from the chart. "It's past 5. Program office closes at 5. I stayed to observe. They have a reading room." She turned a page. "What did you read?" "Information pamphlets about veteran transitions." "Very thorough." Pause. The pen moved. "Captain Marsh, I need you to hear me when I say this, not as a deflection, not as a cover story. Hear me." She set the pen down and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was close to exhaustion, but wasn't quite, because exhaustion had a softness to it, and this didn't. This was the expression of someone who had made peace with a heavy thing and did not appreciate being asked to pick it up again. "Whatever you're looking for, whatever you think you saw in this hallway today, I can't be that for you. I understand that you're carrying something. I understand that finding answers matters to you, but I have a life here. I built it carefully, and I need you to let me keep it." Declan was quiet for a moment. Then, "The patient we just watched almost die. Do you know what his name is?" She blinked. "No. I don't have access to his intake file. His name is Warren Tate. He's a veteran. Former 75th Rangers, 2 deployments. He's been a patient here 4 times in the last 2 years, all psych-related, and today he drove himself to the emergency bay because he thought he was having a heart attack." Declan paused. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a tension pneumothorax caused by a fragment that's been sitting in his left chest wall since Kandahar. Nobody caught it in 4 previous visits. You caught it in about 30 seconds. Nadia said nothing. "You caught it because you've seen that presentation before," Declan said. "Not in a hospital, in the field, where the resources are bad and the time is worse, and you have to be right the first time, because there's no second chance." She picked up her pen. "Nadia." He said her name carefully, without familiarity, The way you say a word you want to land cleanly. I have a burned photograph, part of a face. And I have one word that was used during an extraction that wasn't supposed to happen in a country we weren't supposed to be in. And my dog knows you. Not because you smell like treats or because you're kind to animals, because he knows you the way he knows people who were there. She was very still. Say the word, he said quietly. If I'm wrong, I'll leave this building and I won't come back. Nothing, 10 seconds, 15. Then, barely above a whisper, what word? He leaned forward and said it, and Nadia Varas closed her eyes. It lasted about 2 seconds, that closure. When she opened them, she was already rebuilding the composure, coming back up like a wall with visible mortar lines, and Declan could see the effort it took and felt something complicated about watching someone work that hard to stay sealed. Stood up from the nurse's station. I need to check on a patient, she said. Nadia, give me 10 minutes. She walked down the corridor. He watched her go. Bravo's tail moved once, slowly against the floor. She didn't come back in 10 minutes. Came back in 22, and she came back with the particular set of her shoulders that said she had spent 22 minutes making a decision and was not entirely at peace with it, but had made it anyway. She stopped 4 feet from him. Not here, she said. Not in this building. He nodded. There's a park 2 blocks north. It has a dog walk path. She looked at Bravo. 15 minutes. That's all I'm agreeing to. The park was narrow and poorly lit in the November dusk, and the dog walk path was gravel and puddles from the morning's rain, and neither of them said anything until they were away from the hospital's exterior cameras and far enough from the street that the traffic noise became background rather than foreground. Then Nadia stopped walking and turned to face him, and the careful, reconstructed composure was still present, but had a different quality in the open air, less structural, less performed. She shoved her hands into the pockets of her fleece. If you go public with any of this, she said, I need you to understand what that means for me. I have a job. I have a lease. I have 2 therapy appointments a month and a dog named Stella and a standing dinner reservation on Thursdays. I built all of that from nothing, and I built it deliberately, and it's not much, but it's mine. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, Declan said. Okay, she exhaled. Her breath misted in the cold. Yes, I was there. He'd known it for hours. Hearing it still did something to his chest that he couldn't cleanly identify. My name wasn't always Varas, she said. My grandmother's maiden name. Took it when I came out. She paused on that word came out as if she was aware of its double meaning and had used it deliberately and without apology. I was Lieutenant Nadia Roussel, Naval Special Warfare Support. Medical attachment to a team that officially doesn't have records of me, because 6 weeks after Operation Iron Corridor, I was administratively reassigned into a personnel limbo that took another 8 months to fully disappear me from. Who ordered it? She was quiet. Nadia. I don't know, she said, and it was the first thing she'd said that had the sound of something unresolved underneath it. Recovery facility in Germany. She pulled her right hand out of her pocket, and in the park's low light, he could see the full extent of it properly. For the first time, not just the 2 fingers, but the scar tissue running along the palm and up toward the wrist, kind of damage that happens fast and at high temperature. I lost 2 months to surgery and infection and the specific kind of cognitive fog that comes with heavy pain management. When I was clear enough to ask questions, my file was already gone. My CO was on assignment. My liaison officer had transferred. There was a woman from a JAG office who came to see me and spoke very carefully and said that given the nature of the operations classification, my continued engagement with the record would complicate ongoing national security interests, so they scared you off. I was 29 years old, and I had a hand that didn't fully work, and I was already trying to figure out how to rebuild a career, Nadia said, and there was no self-pity in it, just fact. Flat delivery of someone who had long since finished being angry about the events themselves and was only occasionally angry about being asked to revisit them. Yes, it wasn't hard to scare me off. And then I built Varas and moved here and figured that was the end of it. Bravo had settled at her feet without being invited. She looked down at him. He was trapped under a collapsed support beam, she said, quietly. You were unconscious 8 meters away, and the 2 others had already evac'd. Everyone else had gone. The timer on the secondary device was, I didn't actually know how much time was left. I made a guess. You went back in for a dog, Declan said. I went back in because he was alive and he was scared and he was going to burn, Nadia said. The fact that he was a dog didn't seem relevant at the time. Declan looked at Bravo. Bravo had his chin on Nadia's shoe. I went back in for you too, she added, almost as an aside. That was less of a choice. You had a femoral bleed and a structural piece of debris I needed to stabilize before moving you. Took time. 43 minutes. She looked up. You were tracking time? In and out. I remember your voice. She looked away. Something moved through her expression, not discomfort exactly. More like the feeling of having a private thing seen. Talked a lot, she said. It was one of my field techniques. Stimulation through verbal engagement. Keeps a patient neurologically present. She paused. Also, I was terrified, and it helped me. That admission, small and clearly not easy, landed differently than everything else she'd said. Declan had built an idea of her over 7 years from a burned photograph and a memory. And the idea had been something close to mythic, because that was what people did with the things that saved them. The woman standing in this cold park, admitting she'd talked to keep herself from falling apart, was harder to hold in the mind. And also, he thought, considerably more real. You used the word with Bravo, he said. Yes. Where did that come from? It wasn't in any protocol. Nadia almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself. I made it up. We'd been in 3 operations together at that point, that team and me. The dog and I had developed, I don't know what you'd call it, a working understanding. She looked at Bravo, who was still very much treating her left shoe as a pillow. He was starting to spiral when I found him. Smoke inhalation, the beam on his back leg, he couldn't orient. I needed him to trust me fast. I used a sound pattern that I'd used with him before in decompression exercises. It wasn't a classified call sign. It was just something he knew. He never responded to it after, Declan said. Not with any of his handlers. They tried everything. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Animals are specific, she said finally. They trust who they trust. She left at 8:15. She said she'd think about what he'd asked, which was not much, just to let him start making some calls, to let him try, and she said she wasn't making any promises, and he said he understood, and Bravo watched her walk back toward the park's north exit with the focused, mournful attention of a dog whose instincts and training were pulling in the same direction. Declan took out his phone and called his adjutant again. I need everything you can find on a Dr. Reed Callum, he said, Chief of Trauma Services, Callaway Veterans Medical Center. Specifically, any relationships to naval personnel administrative processes in the last decade, and any financial or professional connections to naval command structures. There was a pause on the other end. That's a broad ask. I know. Start broad. He walked back to the hospital parking structure and sat in his truck for a while before driving, turning over everything Nadia had said, and more specifically, everything she hadn't. The JAG officer. The careful language about national security interests. The speed with which a 29-year-old with a compromised hand and no institutional support had been effectively erased. Callum. The speed with which Callum had appeared. The way he'd framed Nadia's military history not as a background fact, but as a weapon. She has a history that makes certain interactions stressful, as if he had the history in a file and had used it before. Declan drove back to the naval lodging facility near base and took Bravo for a late walk in the wet parking lot and did not sleep much. He was back at Callaway by 7:30 the next morning. Nadia was already on shift. He saw her through the glass doors of the east wing before he badged in, moving down the corridor with the same efficient quietness, and he stood for a second, just watching the way the rest of the floor moved around her, not with her. Around her, the way people move around furniture they've stopped seeing. He had watched enough of the previous day to know that this was the shape of her existence here. Present, functional, unremarkable by institutional design. Noticed only when someone needed something done correctly. He had barely made it to the east wing corridor when he heard the voices. Callum's office was adjacent to the wing, a glass-walled room that looked out onto the staff corridor, and its door was open by about 6 inches. Callum was inside, Nadia was inside, and a third person was inside a woman Declan hadn't seen before. Administrative lanyard, tablet in hand, the composed expression of someone who handled uncomfortable conversations for a living. Declan slowed. He did not stop. He moved at a pace that allowed him to hear, without making it visible that he was listening. Callum's voice, a pattern of boundary violations that I can no longer overlook. Yesterday's incident in Trauma Room 2 is documented. The resident has filed a formal account. You performed an invasive procedure outside your nursing scope. Nadia's voice level. The patient was in cardiac arrest. You have no authority. He was going to die, doctor. Callum, that is not your determination to make. Callum's voice dropped, took on the particular texture of patience being weaponized. Nadia, I've given you considerable latitude given your background. Your history with trauma is documented, and I have consistently advocated for accommodations. My history with trauma. That most supervisors wouldn't extend. But what happened yesterday crossed a line, and I have a responsibility to this institution and to patient safety. You want to talk about patient safety? Her voice had not risen. That was the thing. It stayed exactly level, and the levelness was more striking than volume would have been. Warren Tate had a hemopneumothorax that 4 previous physicians at this institution missed across 4 admissions. He almost died on your watch, in your trauma room, while you were ordering epinephrine for a tension presentation. Procedure I performed was correct. The patient is alive, and the disciplinary review board will take that into account, Callum said smoothly. The review must happen. Given the circumstances, I'm placing you on administrative suspension pending the outcome. 2 weeks with pay. Silence. Declan kept walking. He rounded the corridor bend, found a supply alcove, and stopped. He heard Callum continue. I'm also recommending that your access to trauma rotation be reassigned during the suspension period. This is for the well-being of the unit, and frankly, Nadia, for yours. You've been under considerable stress. The door opened. Nadia came out first, and Declan could see her from the alcove, her face completely, scrupulously blank. The blankness of someone who had made the active decision not to give the room behind her the satisfaction of an expression. She had her badge in her hand, and she was looking at the floor 3 feet ahead of her, and her right hand, the damaged hand, was curled against her thigh. She walked right past the alcove. She walked 6 more paces down the corridor. Then she stopped and put one hand flat against the wall, and stood there with her head down for about 15 seconds, not moving. Declan did not move either. He watched her not move. He understood without any complicated analysis, just directly, that this was a moment that required no assistance and no witness, and that the most respectful thing he could do was stay very still in the alcove and pretend he was not there. After 15 seconds, she straightened. She put her badge in her pocket. She walked to the break room, and the break room door closed, and it stayed closed. He was waiting when she came out 12 minutes later with her bag over her shoulder and her civilian jacket on over her scrubs. She saw him immediately, and her expression said that she was not surprised, which itself said something, that she had known he was in the building, had probably known since 7:30, and had processed it alongside everything else she'd processed in the last hour. Bending you, Declan said. Yes, for saving a patient's life. For practicing medicine without a license is what the paperwork will say. It's not what happened. I know what happened, Nadia said. Kept walking. He fell into step beside her, Bravo adjusting fluidly to the change in direction. Question is what the board will say happened, which is a different thing. You fight it? She pushed through the side exit into the cold gray morning. What? He has the institutional record. He has the resident's statement. He has my file, which includes she stopped, recalibrated. He has access to information about my background that I did not give him and have never understood how he obtained. There it was. He knows about your military record, Declan said. The record. The record doesn't exist anymore. He knows about the shape of it. The fact that there was something. The circumstances of my discharge. She was walking faster than she probably realized. The first time I asked for trauma rotation access, 3 years ago, he pulled me aside and told me that, given my history with combat trauma, he wanted to make sure I was emotionally stable enough for high-stress cases. The phrasing was very considered. He was very pleasant about it. Her jaw was tight. Been using it every time since. Every time I push back on a clinical decision. Every time I catch something he missed. Where did he get the information? I've been trying to figure that out for 3 years. Declan had his phone out. He pulled up the preliminary notes his adjutant had sent at 5 that morning, sparse, preliminary, but there was a thread in there, a thin one, a name that appeared in both a Naval Personnel Administrative Subcommittee from 8 years ago and in Callaway's Institutional Board of Directors. It wasn't proof of anything. It was a thread. He showed it to her. Nadia stopped walking. She looked at the screen for a long time. Something shifted in her face, not the controlled, managed shift of someone maintaining a front, but the raw, unguarded shift of someone who has spent years on a puzzle and has just been handed a piece they didn't know existed. That name, she said. You recognize it. The JAG officer who came to see me in Germany. She looked up. That was his name. The morning traffic moved past them on the wet street. Bravo sat between them and looked at nothing in particular with the settled patience of a dog, who understood that humans sometimes needed a moment to catch up to information. Declan looked at the thread on his phone. He looked at Nadia's face. He looked at the thread again. Nadia, he said slowly, I think your file wasn't erased because of the operation's classification. She was already there. He could see it in her expression. She'd been almost there for 3 years and had just arrived. Someone buried it specifically, she said. Someone who had a reason to make sure you couldn't make noise from inside any military structure, Declan said. And who then made sure you couldn't make noise from inside this one either. She stood very still in the gray morning, with her bag on her shoulder and her suspended badge in her pocket and her damaged hand at her side. Bigger than an operations classification, she said. It wasn't a question, I think so. She looked at him directly, for the first time without the careful filtering, just looked at him the way she had probably looked at things before she learned to manage what her face did with information that felt dangerous. I need you to understand, she said, that if we start pulling this thread, I lose everything I built. The job, the apartment, the structure of my life. All of it goes into a process that I do not control. I know, Declan said. And you're asking me anyway. I'm not asking anything, he said. I'm showing you what I found. What you do with it is yours. She looked away. She looked at the hospital, building the glass and concrete, the flickering east wing light, visible even from outside, the sign above the entrance that said Callaway Veterans Medical Center, serving those who served, and something moved through her expression that had no clean name, but that Declan read as the specific grief of a person looking at a place they built a life around and seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, what the place had cost them. I need 24 hours, she said. He nodded. She walked away toward the parking structure, and Bravo tracked her with his eyes, and Bravo looked at Declan until she turned the corner, and then the dog looked Declan was fairly certain a behavioral scientist would describe as expectant. Declan's phone rang. His adjutant, he answers. You need to know something, the adjutant said. That name you sent me the subcommittee connection. I dug one layer deeper. And the personnel administrative order that removed Roussel from the naval record? It wasn't filed by the Operation Command. It was filed by a civilian contractor attached to naval oversight. A pause. Contractor's institutional affiliation, at the time of filing, was a hospital board. Declan's chest went very still. Which hospital board? Callaway Veterans Medical Center. He stood on the wet street with the phone at his ear and Bravo at his side, and the full shape of it landing in his mind like something that had been falling for a long time and had just hit the floor. Callum hadn't accidentally obtained her file. He had been part of burying it. Declan stood on that wet street for another 30 seconds after the call ended, not because he needed the time to process the shape of it, was already clear, but because he'd learned years ago that the moment between receiving information and acting on it mattered, that the decisions made in that gap were either deliberate or reactive, and reactive decisions in complex situations had a way of costing people things they couldn't get back, called Nadia. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't gone far. Don't go home yet, he said. A pause. Why? Because I just found out that Callum wasn't a coincidence in your life. He was a mechanism. The silence on her end had a particular texture, not the silence of someone who needed the statement explained, but the silence of someone absorbing a confirmation of something they'd suspected and had always hoped they were wrong about. Where are you? She said. Still outside the parking structure. Stay there. She came back around the corner 40 seconds later, still in the civilian jacket, bag on her shoulder, moving at a pace that was controlled but had urgency underneath it. She stopped in front of him, and he showed her the adjutant's follow-up message. On his phone, the name, the date, the institutional affiliation, the administrative order number, and she read it once, top to bottom, and then she read it again. He filed the order, she said. A contractor affiliated with his board did. Close enough. He's been here the whole time. The words came out quiet, and there was something in them, that was past anger, the particular quality of a person who has been in a room with their enemy for 3 years and shared coffee with them and been patronized by them and worn their sanity down against the smooth, immovable surface of their institutional power, and who has just learned that the enemy knew exactly what they were doing. He knew who I was when he hired me. I think so. Kept me here, she said. Not a question. Working it out, where he could see me, where he could manage the narrative if I ever started to surface. She looked at the hospital building, the accommodations he kept referencing, the access he kept limiting. That wasn't supervision. That was containment. Declan said nothing. Sometimes the right move was to let the person arrive at the full shape of a thing in their own time, without commentary. Nadia's damaged hand came up and pressed against her sternum for a moment, not a dramatic gesture, just a person needing to physically locate themselves. And then she dropped it. What do we do? She said. We need someone with jurisdiction and rank who isn't connected to the thread, Declan said. Someone who can pull the sealed operation file without triggering the people who sealed it. Do you have someone like that? He had been turning that question over since 5 that morning. I have a name, he said. I don't know yet if she's reachable or if she's clean. I need to make a call I've been putting off for 2 years. Nadia looked at him steadily. Make it. The name was Rear Admiral Sylvia Okafor. Declan had served under her indirectly during his 3rd deployment. She'd been a captain then, running a Naval Special Operations Oversight Division with a reputation for being difficult to manage upward, which in Declan's experience meant she was honest. She had retired from active command 18 months ago and moved into an advisory role with the Naval Inspector General's office, which was either the best or worst possible position for what he was about to ask, depending entirely on whether she still operated by the principles she'd had when he knew her. He made the call from the truck, windows up, Bravo in the back seat. Nadia sat in the passenger seat and looked at the parking structure wall and did not listen to the call in any obvious way, which was a courtesy, he noted. Okafor answered on the 4th ring with the clipped directness of someone who did not use phone greetings as social warmers. Marsh, Admiral, I need 15 minutes. You've been building to this call for a while, she said. He hadn't told her he was building to anything. How do you know that? Because you've contacted 2 Naval Personnel Records contacts and a JAG-adjacent source in the last 18 hours. Using channels that are informal enough to think they're invisible but aren't. A pause. Also, you pinged Hollister in the IG's adjunct office 6 months ago, asking general questions about sealed operational files that were specific enough not to be general. I've been waiting. He processed that. You've been tracking my inquiries. Someone has to. The operation you're poking at has more interested parties than you know. Her voice shifted not softer, but more direct. The shift from administrative caution to something that chose words for precision rather than protection. What did you find? He told her. All of it, Nadia. The administrative order, the contractor affiliation, Callum, the suspension. Kept it to facts and sequence. Okafor did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for about 8 seconds. The woman is at that hospital right now, she said. In the parking structure with me, yes. And Callum knows you've been in contact with her. He knows I was in the building. He doesn't know what I found this morning. He will soon, Okafor said. People with that kind of institutional arrangement don't stay uninformed for long. You have maybe a day before he starts making calls of his own. Another pause. I need to make 2 calls. Do not go back into that hospital today. Do not let her go back in either. I'll contact you by this evening. Admiral, is the operation file recoverable? The pause this time was different. Weighted. Parts of it were never actually sealed, she said finally. They were filed in a classification tier that requires a specific request from an oversight authority to access. No one with the right authority has ever made the request. She stopped, until possibly now. The call ended. Declan put the phone down and relayed the summary to Nadia, who had been looking at the parking structure wall and had not moved. She turned when he was done. She knows the file exists, Nadia said. More than that. I think she's been waiting for someone to pull the right thread. Nadia was quiet for a moment. And in the meantime, we just wait? In the meantime, we don't give Callum anything to work with. She nodded. She looked at her hands, both of them, the damaged right and the undamaged left, and the look on her face was not readable, or not fully readable, which he was beginning to understand was her baseline. Layers of legibility, the outermost layer was control. Beneath that, something that he thought might be the closest thing she allowed herself to hope, But she kept that one wrapped. I haven't told you everything, she said. He waited. The Operation Iron Corridor. The reason the site compromised the way it did. She stopped. Started again. There was a communication failure. Targeting error that put our position inside a fire corridor it wasn't supposed to be inside. That kind of error doesn't happen randomly. Equipment, coordinates, timing, all of it, pointed to an intelligence leak inside the operations planning structure. She looked at him. I filed an informal report about it. 3 days before my file disappeared. Parking structure was very quiet. You filed a report naming an intelligence failure, Declan said slowly, and 3 days later your record was erased. I didn't name anyone specifically. I didn't have enough to name anyone. But I flagged the pattern, and I filed it with my medical liaison. And 48 hours later, I was in a German recovery facility, and 72 hours after that, my file was in the process of being consolidated. Her jaw was tight. I've had 7 years to think about the sequence. Why didn't you tell me this last night? Because I needed to know if you were actually looking for the truth, or just looking for the person who saved you, she said. Those are 2 different searches, and they don't always end in the same place. He sat with that. It was fair. It was more than fair. It was the kind of careful, experienced judgment that came from having trusted an institution once and learned in very specific detail what that cost. Both, he said. I'm doing both, and I understand if that's complicated. Smiled. Almost. It's complicated, she agreed. Okafor called back at 6:47 that evening. Declan and Nadia were in a diner 4 blocks from the hospital neutral ground, poor lighting, good sightlines, to the door with coffee. Nadia wasn't drinking, and a plate of food. Declan had ordered mostly to justify the table. Bravo was in the truck in the parking lot, windows cracked, with a water bowl and what Declan assessed as a reasonable level of canine patience. He put the phone on speaker. I made the access request this afternoon, Okafor said. The IG's office has the authority under a 2019 oversight directive that the original classification didn't anticipate. File is being processed now. A pause. What came back in the preliminary poll is enough to open a formal review. Nadia leaned forward slightly. The targeting error Roussel flagged was documented, Okafor said. Her informal report exists in a communication archive that was never purged because it was filed through a medical channel rather than a command channel. Someone cleaned the command files and missed the medical thread. Another pause. The error traced back to a coordinates package that was modified 16 hours before the operation launched. The modification was logged under a contractor access ID. The same contractor category as Callum's board affiliation? Declan said. Adjacent. It's not a direct line yet, but it's close enough that the IG's office is treating it as material. Okafor's voice was flat and careful. I'm also sending 2 things to your secure contact point tonight. The first is a provisional restoration of Lieutenant Roussel's service record. It won't be public until the review concludes, but it's in the system. The second is a formal notice to Callaway Veterans Medical Center that Nurse Varas Roussel is a person of interest in an active naval oversight investigation, and that any administrative action against her is subject to review for interference. Nadia sat back in the diner booth. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Her face was Declan, searched for the word, and landed on unguarded. The first time he'd seen her face go entirely unguarded. It only lasted a second, but it was there. That second notice, she said. That reverses the suspension? It doesn't reverse it technically, Okafor said, but it makes pursuing it inadvisable for any administrator who wants to keep his own position, which your Dr. Callum will understand the moment it arrives. A pause. Admiral, that's what I'd prefer you call me, if we're going to be talking regularly about this. Admiral, Nadia said. Yes, understood. I need both of you at Callaway tomorrow morning at 9. I'm sending a representative from the IG's office to receive Callum's administrative files under the oversight directive. It would be useful to have you both present. A pause. Marsh, bring the dog. The call ended. Nadia looked at the untouched coffee. She picked it up and took a long drink, and the coffee was clearly cold, and she didn't appear to care. Tomorrow at 9, Declan said. I heard. She put the cup down. He's going to know something is coming before we walk through the door. Probably. He has 12 hours to move paperwork, call contacts, build a version of events. People with his kind of arrangement usually do that, Declan said. And it usually doesn't hold, because the thing about a thread that goes back 7 years is that there's a lot of it. You can't move all of it in 12 hours. She looked at him across the table with an expression that was calculating and tired in roughly equal measure. "You've done this before," she said. "Followed something back this far." "Once," he said. "It took longer than this and ended messier. But it ended." She nodded. She looked at the diner window, the dark street, the wet reflections of street lights in the puddles that were still present from yesterday's rain. "Call my landlord," she said. "Tell him I might be. I don't know what I might be. I don't know what happens after tomorrow." "Neither do I," Declan said. The honest answer. She appreciated that, he could tell. She didn't want the version where he told her it would be fine. They were at Callaway at 8:45. Okafor's representative was already in the lobby when they arrived, a lieutenant commander named Reyes, compact and quiet, with a document case, and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where people did not want them. He shook hands with both of them, looked at Bravo without comment, and said that Admiral Okafor's formal notice had been delivered to Callum's administrative email at 7 a.m. Declan watched Nadia's face when she walked through the hospital's side entrance for the first time since her suspension. She had chosen, he noticed, to wear her civilian clothes rather than scrubs, which was either a deliberate statement or simply the practical choice of someone who was not currently on shift. Her ID badge was in her jacket pocket. She did not put it on. The East Wing staff registered her presence before she'd made it 20 feet down the corridor. He watched it happen. A nurse looked up, recognized her, did a visible recalibration of what her presence on a suspended day meant, and then looked past her at Reyes's document case and the navel-adjacent composure of the woman carrying it. Word moved fast in hospital corridors. Within 4 minutes, there were people finding reasons to be in the East Wing who hadn't been there before. Callum appeared at the door of his glass-walled office at 8:58. He looked at Reyes first, then at Declan, then at Nadia, and the look he gave her was complex in a way that Declan read as a man running calculations how much she knew, how far the thread had reached, whether 12 hours had been enough. His expression was controlled and professional, because men like Callum defaulted to controlled and professional the way other people defaulted to breathing. But underneath the control, something had shifted. He knew the ground had changed. He was trying to determine how much. "Lieutenant Commander Reyes," he said, extending his hand. Smooth, practiced. "I received the Admiral's notice this morning. I want to be clear that Callaway has always been fully cooperative with naval oversight inquiries." "I'm sure," Reyes said. She did not perform warmth. "I'll need access to administrative personnel files for the last 8 years, specifically any files that reference contract affiliations with naval personnel processing. I'll also need the complete record of all administrative actions involving Nurse Varas and the documentation session reporting yesterday's suspension. Of course, my office manager can." "Now, if you're ready," Reyes said. "The Admiral would like the preliminary review completed by noon." Callum's composure held. Just. He led Reyes toward the administrative corridor, and as he moved away from the East Wing, staff members who had found reasons to be nearby watched him go in the way. Hospital staff always watched the administrator leave a scene with the collective attentiveness of a group of people who have learned that. The way a powerful man exits a room tells you things. Nadia watched him too. Declan watched Nadia. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Ask me in an hour," she said. The hour broke at the 40-minute mark. Reyes came out of the administrative corridor with a second document case. She hadn't gone in, with someone on Callum's staff had. Apparently, decided that cooperation was in their professional interest and had provided materials beyond what was formally requested. Declan saw the second case and read the situation. There was someone in that office who had been uncomfortable with something for a while and had just been handed a sanctioned opportunity to hand it over. Reyes found them in the East Wing family alcove and opened the case enough for Declan to see the top document without touching it. Personnel audit trail, cross-referenced with contractor logs. Dates going back 9 years. "There's more than we expected," Reyes said quietly. "The Admiral needs to see this before it goes anywhere else. I'm returning to the IG's office now." She looked at Nadia. "Your reinstatement processing is going to move faster than we told you. Expect contact by end of day." She left. The East Wing continued its morning. An orderly passed with a supply cart. 2 nurses exchanged information at the station in the focused shorthand of shift overlap. The East Wing light, the one that had been flickering for 3 weeks, had inexplicably stopped flickering. Someone had finally fixed it. And then the trauma chime sounded. Not the overhead chime, a different alert. The internal rapid response, which meant something had gone wrong inside the building, rather than incoming from outside. The nursing station activated immediately. 2 nurses moving. A resident looking up from his tablet. Someone reaching for the phone. The call came through to the station 30 seconds later, and Declan was close enough to hear it. Rapid response to the 4th floor. Veteran recovery unit. Patient in respiratory distress. Suspected pulmonary embolism. He looked at Nadia. Nadia was already looking at the elevator. He said, "I know. If you go up there." "I know that too." She didn't move yet. She stood at the edge of the alcove, one hand on the wall, and he could see her doing the calculation, the real one, not the institutional one. Life in one column. Everything she'd spent 3 years building in the other. What floor is veteran recovery? 4. Who's on call up there? He looked at the nursing station. One of the nurses caught his eye. She'd heard the call. She knew. "Dr. Callum covers veteran recovery," the nurse said quietly. "And he's in the administrative meeting." Nadia's hand came off the wall. She walked to the elevator and pressed 4. And the doors opened and she stepped in. And Declan followed her, because he'd stopped having the option of not following her somewhere around. The point she stepped forward with that needle the previous afternoon. And Bravo followed him, because Bravo had made his own position clear from the beginning. The 4th floor was controlled chaos in the specific way that hospital emergencies produce not panic, but concentrated urgency, bodies moving with purpose, voices at elevated but professional registers. Nadia came off the elevator and oriented in about 2 seconds, reading the room the way she'd been reading rooms since before she'd become Varas, and she moved toward the patient's room at the pace that was fast but not running. The patient was a man, mid-60s, former military, from the look of his bearing even unconscious. His color wrong, not pale, cyanotic, the lips edging toward blue, in the way that meant oxygenation was failing, faster than the supplemental oxygen they'd already applied could compensate. A nurse Declan didn't know was managing the oxygen. A resident had the chart and was reading from it with the focused urgency of someone who had identified the most probable diagnosis and was running through the protocol and was not quite fast enough. Nadia looked at the patient's legs. "Any calf swelling on intake?" she asked the room. The nurse looked up, registered Nadia's suspended status from the scrub she wasn't wearing, registered the urgency in the question, and made a decision. Left calf was flagged on admission. Ultrasound wasn't ordered yet. PE, Nadia said to the resident. Massive. SAT, 81 and dropping. He needs thrombolytics now, not in 10 minutes. Does he have contraindications on his chart? The resident scanned. No recent surgery. No bleeding history. Then we're giving TPA. Call it in. She moved to the patient's side and looked at the nurse. Get me another line. The resident hesitated for exactly 1 second, the gap between institutional protocol and the emergency in front of him, and then he reached for his phone and called the pharmacy because the patient's lips were blue and getting bluer, and hesitation had become more dangerous than deviation. Nadia worked with the controlled, deliberate speed of someone who had done critical interventions in far worse conditions than this. She was not performing competence. She was simply competent, the way a person is competent when something has been trained into them. So deeply it has become a reflex rather than a skill. Her damaged right hand did what it could, and her left hand compensated for what it couldn't, and it was not elegant, but it was effective. And 6 minutes after she came off the elevator, the patient's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 86 and was moving in the right direction. The TPA arrived. The resident administered it under her direction. The room held the collective breath of people watching a margin that was very thin and hoping it would hold. It held. The saturation ticked to 89, then 92. Patient's color was still wrong, but trending. His breathing was easier. The room exhaled. Nadia stepped back from the bed. She stripped her gloves. She'd gotten them from the supply cart by the door, not from any personal kit, because she was suspended and had nothing personal here, and she dropped them in the bin. And she looked at the patient, and for just a moment, her face did the thing it had done in the park the previous evening, the thing that slipped past the management layer. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they almost lost, which was also the way a person looks at something they almost lost in themselves. Then she turned around. Callum was in the doorway. He had come up from the administrative meeting Reyes's process, apparently, required a brief break in proceedings, and he stood in the doorway of room 412 with the document case still in his hand and his face doing something that was more complex than anger. It was the face of a man who had just watched the single thing he'd been working hardest to suppress do the one thing that made it most impossible to suppress. Fourth floor staff was watching. The resident was watching. 2 nurses from the corridor had stopped moving and were watching. And behind Callum, just visible in the hallway, a man Declan hadn't seen before, older, navel-bearing, civilian clothes, the kind of person who looked ordinary enough that you only noticed him if you were trained to notice, people who were trying not to be noticed. Declan looked at the man in the hallway. The man looked back at Declan with a steady appraising recognition that said he knew exactly who Declan was and had known before he walked in. Then the man looked at Nadia, and something in his face, old, guarded, and not easy to read, shifted into something that was not quite regret, but was in the same family. He stepped around Callum and into the room. "Lieutenant Roussel," he said. The room went still in the way. Rooms went still when a gravity shifted. Nadia turned. She looked at the man, and the color left her face, not faint, not shock exactly. The color of someone who has just seen a ghost that they had decided years ago was the one thing they would never have to face. "Admiral Kessler," she said. Callum took a step forward. "Sir, I need to explain." "No," the Admiral said, without looking at him. His eyes were on Nadia. "You don't." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a document not thick, just a few folded pages, and he held it out to her. "This is a provisional restoration," he said, "and an apology, officially entered into the record as of this morning." He paused. "I know what that's worth. I know what it doesn't cover. But it's there." Nadia did not take the document immediately. She looked at it. She looked at him. 7 years of a rebuilt life and a damaged hand, and a borrowed name and therapy appointments and careful construction of a self that could survive in a world that had erased the previous one, all of it visible in the 3 seconds she stood there without reaching for the paper. Then she took it. And that was the moment Callum finally understood that the architecture he had built and maintained for 9 years had collapsed. And the evidence of that understanding was in his face, and everyone in room 412 on the 4th floor of Callaway Veterans Medical Center saw it. He turned to leave. "Dr. Callum," Ray said from the doorway she had followed up from the administrative floor, at some point, quietly, the way she did everything. "We're not finished downstairs." Callum stopped. He stood in the doorway with his back to the room, and Declan watched the set of his shoulders and thought about the specific posture of a man who has run out of the moves he prepared for and is standing in the gap between what he planned and what is actually happening. Then one of the nurses on the 4th floor, a young woman who had been standing in the corridor doorway throughout, and whom Declan had barely registered, took a single step into the room and looked at Nadia. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, meaning the patient. Nadia looked at the man in the bed. The numbers on his monitor were steady. Not good, not yet, but stable in the direction of recoverable. "Yes," she said. The nurse nodded and went back to her station. And that small, practical exchange, the question, the answer, the returning to work was somehow the most human thing that had happened in the last 2 days. And it landed in the room without drama and without ceremony, which was probably why it landed at all. Declan looked at Nadia. She was still holding the restoration document, looking at the patient's monitor, and she had not yet processed whatever Admiral Kessler's presence meant, the full weight of it. Question of why he was here, and who had sent him, and what his appearance meant for the part of the story that hadn't happened yet. Declan's phone buzzed. A message from his adjutant. Text only. No subject line. Kessler's presence not coordinated with IG's office. He came separately. Find out who he's been talking to, and why he came today specifically. Declan read it twice. Then he looked at Kessler, who had moved to the window and was looking at the gray morning outside with the composure of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now discovering that rehearsal and execution were not the same thing. And Declan thought, he didn't come because of Okafor's inquiry. He came because he found out we were here, which means someone told him. And the only people who knew both our identities and our location were people already inside this investigation. He put the phone in his pocket. "Admiral," he said. Kessler turned. "Who told you to come today?" "The hallway." The old man looked at him, and the steadiness in his eyes was the steadiness of someone who had spent a career making decisions that had consequences and had learned to inhabit the weight of those decisions without letting them show. That's a conversation for a room without an audience, he said. Then we should find one, Declan said, quickly. Because whoever told you we were here, if it wasn't Okafor, then someone else already knows everything we know. And they've had since this morning to decide what to do about it. Kessler's gaze moved to Nadia. Nadia was looking at the document in her hand. And then she looked up, and what was in her face was not the controlled blankness. And it was not the unguarded moment from the diner. And it was not the grief she'd shown, looking at the hospital from outside. It was something harder and cleaner than any of those things. It was the look of a person who has been surviving on endurance for a very long time and has just, for the first time, seen something worth moving toward instead of just away from. She folded the document. She put it in her jacket pocket. Wherever that room is, she said, I'm coming. And Kessler, who had come here to do one thing and now found himself in the middle of something considerably larger, nodded. And Callum, still standing in the doorway with Reyes at his back, understood for the first time that the investigation he was facing was not the one he had been preparing for, that the thread Declan had found ran deeper than Okafor's office, deeper than the contractor logs, deeper than 9 years of a carefully maintained arrangement, and that somewhere in the structure of what he'd built, there was a crack that was not going to hold. The room they found was a fourth-floor conference room, used for family consultations, small, no windows to the corridor, a table with 6 chairs, and a whiteboard with someone's half-erased medication schedule still visible on it. Reyes posted herself outside the door. Declan, Nadia, and Kessler went in. Kessler sat down without being invited, which was the move of a man who was used to rooms conforming to him and had not yet fully recalibrated to the fact that this one wouldn't. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at them both. Who sent you? Declan asked. He stayed standing. So did Nadia. No one sent me, Kessler said. I came because Callum called me at 6 this morning. He told me the IG's office had made a records request and that a naval officer was in the building asking questions about a classified operation. A pause. Thought I would help him. Would you have, Nadia said. A week ago. Would you have? The Admiral was quiet for a moment. Not evasive processing, which was different. I don't know, he said. That's the honest answer, and I understand it's not a satisfying one. It's not, she said. The arrangement, Callum had the contractor affiliation. The personnel order, I knew parts of it. He looked at the table. After Iron Corridor, there was pressure from above my pay grade to contain the intelligence failure question. Not investigate it. Contain it. Your report flagged the targeting error, and the people who needed that error to stay unflagged made decisions I should have pushed back against and didn't. You let them erase me, Nadia said. Yes. He said it without softening it. I was told it was temporary. The classification hold while the targeting inquiry ran its course. I believed that for about 3 months, and by the time I understood the hold was permanent, the mechanism was already outside my authority to reverse. And Callum? Callum was already placed. His board affiliation, the contractor connection that predated my involvement. He was their asset in the civilian medical structure. When you surfaced at Callaway, it wasn't random. They tracked you there. Nadia's hand pressed flat on the table. They placed me. Kessler didn't answer immediately, and his silence was its own answer. The job posting, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. 7 years ago, I found the Callaway, posting through a veterans transition network. Thought it was luck. She stopped. They put it in front of me. They wanted me somewhere they could manage. I believe so, Kessler said. Yes. Declan watched Nadia absorb that. It took about 10 seconds, the full scope of it. The years of careful reconstruction, the choices that felt like her own, the life she thought she'd built on her terms, and he watched her face move through something that had no clean name and came out the other side not broken, which surprised him, and also didn't, because he was beginning to understand that she had been surviving inside impossible geometries for a long time, and had developed a tolerance for them that most people didn't have. The targeting error, Declan said to Kessler. The inquiry that supposedly ran its course. What did it actually find? That's what I came to tell you, Kessler said, because Callum doesn't know that part. What he knows is the surface arrangement personnel management, institutional oversight, keeping Roussel contained. What he doesn't know is that the targeting error inquiry was closed without findings, and the reason it was closed without findings is that the individual responsible was inside the closing authority. Name, Declan said. A contractor program director named Harlan Vest. He ran the intelligence coordination package for Iron Corridor. Targeting modification that put your team inside the fire corridor was run through his access ID. We established that much. Vest claimed the modification was a system error. The inquiry accepted that explanation because the inquiry chair had a contractual relationship with Vest's program. Kessler paused. Vest retired 2 years ago, but his program is still active and is currently supporting 3 operational packages. So the person responsible for the targeting failure that nearly killed my team, Declan, started. He was never held accountable, no. And he's still operational. Technically, yes. The conference room was very quiet for a moment. Outside the door, the 4th floor moved the sounds of a working hospital, monitors and footsteps, and the distant chime of an elevator. And in here, the 3 of them sat with the weight of 9 years of protected negligence laid out on a table with a half-erased medication schedule on the whiteboard above it. The IG's request this morning, Declan said. Does it reach Vest? That depends on what Reyes found in Callum's files, Kessler said. There's a documented financial connection between Callum's contractor affiliation and Vest's program, then yes. The IG can extend the inquiry scope. Declan opened the door and asked Reyes to come in. Reyes had found a financial connection. She laid it out at the table with the economy of someone trained to present complex information to people who needed it fast. Callum's original board appointment had been underwritten by a consulting subsidiary that traced back through 2 holding entities to a defense contractor consortium that included Vest's program as a component organization. Payments were structured as institutional grants, untraceable on the surface, routine-looking in any standard audit, but the paper trail Callum's own staff had just handed over in the administrative meeting contained the internal correspondence that named the relationship explicitly. Kept records, Nadia said. Not a question. There was something almost disbelieving in it. People like Callum always keep records, Ray said, because they believe the arrangement is stable, and they want documentation of their end of it in case the other party ever decides to revise history. Protection mechanism that becomes evidence. Can you reach Vest through this? Declan asked. The IG can open a secondary inquiry under the fraud provisions, Reyes said. Given the operational connection to Iron Corridor, it would fall under the same classification tier as Okafor's original request. That means we can move without flagging the standard channels Vest's program has access to. She paused, but it has to be today. If Callum reaches Vest before we have the scope extension filed, Callum's is in the administrative meeting with your staff, Declan said. He was, Reyes said. He left the building 14 minutes ago. Table went quiet. Declan looked at Kessler. He called you at 6 this morning. When you told him you were coming, what did he say? Kessler's jaw tightened slightly. He said he was relieved, that he would handle the Okafor inquiry internally if I could provide context on the classification rationale. He was buying time, Nadia said. He needed time to reach Vest, and he needed a reason to leave the building that wouldn't look like flight. She looked at Declan. You said he left 14 minutes ago. That's right after Kessler arrived. He saw the Admiral walk in, decided the institutional play wasn't going to work, and ran. Reyes was already on her phone. Declan stepped out of the conference room and called his adjutant with 2 requests. Locate Callum's vehicle in the hospital parking structure's exit logs. Cross-reference Vest's program contact directory for any numbers associated with Callum's personal or administrative lines. His adjutant, who had been running on 4 hours of sleep and institutional goodwill for 36 hours, said he would have both in 20 minutes. He had them in 15. Callum's car had exited the parking structure at 9:42, heading south on the main arterial toward the city's financial district, not toward the residential areas where he lived. And Callum's administrative line had placed a call at 9:38, duration 4 minutes and 11 seconds, to a number that his adjutant traced to a law firm that represented, among other clients, Harlan Vest's former consulting subsidiary. Not Vest directly, his lawyers, which meant Callum was not running. He was managing. He was trying to get ahead of the paper trail Reyes had pulled by establishing legal cover before the scope extension could be filed. Declan went back into the conference room and told the room. Reyes said, then we have a narrow window. How narrow? If he has a lawyer making calls on Vest's behalf, before the secondary inquiry is formally opened, there's a procedural challenge available to them that would slow the IG's process by weeks. She was already typing on her tablet. I need Okafor to authorize the scope extension in the next 40 minutes. Then call her, Declan said. I am calling her, Reyes said, with the patience of someone who did not need to be told to do the thing they were doing. Nadia had her arms crossed and was looking at the whiteboard. The half-erased medication schedule. Someone's patient, someone's careful handwriting, the ordinary working residue of a hospital's daily business. He's not going to get clear, she said quietly, mostly to herself. No, Kessler said, he's not. She looked at the Admiral. The look between them was not warm. It was not going to be warm. Not today. Maybe not ever. But it was direct in a way that the previous 7 years had made impossible. You said you came here because Callum called you, she said. But you brought the restoration document. You had it before you walked in. Yes, he said. How long have you had it? A pause. 8 months. Her expression shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly. Months. The IG inquiry wasn't Okafor's first attempt, he said. There was a preliminary review 18 months ago that stalled in the classification structure. I knew about it. When it stalled, I started preparing the restoration documentation. He stopped. He looked at his hands. Because I understood by then that what I'd allowed to happen was not temporary and not correctable through the official channels I'd been waiting on. And because waiting had become the same thing as choosing. You just didn't send it, Nadia said. No. What changed? Marsh started pulling the thread, Kessler said simply. And I knew someone else was finally moving in the same direction. I'd been too careful to move. Nadia absorbed that. The room held it. Then she uncrossed her arms and said, okay. And that single word carried an entire architecture of acceptance, not forgiveness, not absolution, just the practical decision of a person who had more important things to do than stay in the grief of what should have been different. Okafor authorized the scope extension at 10:23. Reyes had the formal filing transmitted to the IG's central registry at 10:31, which was 19 minutes before the law firm representing Vest's subsidiary filed its first procedural challenge, a challenge that, upon review, was found to reference an inquiry that had already been formally expanded beyond the scope the challenge addressed, making it procedurally moot. Declan found out about the moot challenge from his adjutant at 11:15, and he was in the hospital cafeteria when he got the message, sitting across from Nadia with 2 cups of coffee that were both, this time, actually being drunk. Reyes says Vest's legal team filed a challenge, he said. And? Too late. The scope extension was already registered. Nadia's coffee cup paused halfway to her mouth. She set it back down. Something moved through her face that was not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean a word for something this complicated, but was in the territory of a tension that had been held for a very long time beginning, incrementally, to release. What happens to Callum? She said. Short-term, the IG's inquiry freezes his professional standing. The hospital's board will be notified today. His administrative access will be restricted pending the review. And longer term? Depends what the inquiry finds, Declan said. The financial connection to Vest's program holds up, and the correspondence implicates him in the personnel order, then he's looking at professional decertification and potential federal charges under the oversight statutes. Potential, she said. These things take time, he said. That's the honest version. She nodded. She'd been inside institutional processes long enough to know that honest version had lived inside its slow grinding for years. And Vest? The secondary inquiry opens formally this afternoon. Program gets an operational review. If the targeting modification evidence connects to the Iron Corridor casualties, then the DoD has a criminal referral pathway. He paused. That one's slower. It's also bigger. She was quiet for a moment. 2 of the operators from that extraction. Did they? Both alive, he said. Petty Officer Diaz is in California. Sergeant Wakefield is in Georgia. Neither one knows yet that any of this is happening. He watched her face when he said their names, the brief, involuntary movement of someone hearing the names of people they thought they'd lost the right to know were okay. I'll reach out to them. She nodded again, and this time the nod had something extra in it that she didn't put into words, which was fine. He understood it. At 12:40, Callum returned to the hospital. Declan was back in the East Wing when it happened. He'd spent the late morning making calls and had come back to check on Warren Tate's status through the charge nurse, who told him Tate had been moved to a monitored recovery bed and was stable and awake and asking questions about what had happened to him in the trauma room 2 days ago. Declan said he'd like to visit if Tate was willing, and the charge nurse said she'd check. He was waiting on the answer, when Callum came through the main entrance. He did not come through the side entrance. He came through the main entrance in the specific, deliberate way of a man who has spent the last 3 hours with lawyers and has decided that retreat is not the posture he wants, and that the posture he wants is managed confrontation, the return of Anne. Administrator to his building, unhurried, in control. He made it as far as the administrative corridor before he was met by two things he had not anticipated. The hospital's board chair, a woman named Margaret Voss, who had driven in from across the city on 30 minutes' notice after Reyes's formal notification reached the board, and a second IG representative who had arrived from Okafor's office at noon to serve the formal inquiry notice. Declan watched from the East Wing corridor doorway, could not hear the conversation. He could see it Callum's posture, going through 3 distinct adjustments, in about 90 seconds. The first, the posture of a man arriving with prepared language. The second, the posture of a man encountering something his prepared language did not cover. And the third, the posture of a man understanding that the meeting he'd spent 3 hours lawyering for had been structurally bypassed before he walked in the door. Margaret Voss had the formal inquiry notice in her hand. She did not look like a woman who intended to extend professional courtesies. The hospital staff in the administrative corridor were not visibly stopping to watch. They were moving, doing their jobs. The functional work of a medical institution continuing regardless of the human drama adjacent to it, but they were aware. Particular attentiveness of people who were not watching, but were registering every word through their peripheral attention. Callum said something. Voss said something in return. The second IG representative said something that was brief and had the quality of a statement rather than a contribution to a conversation. Callum's administrative access badge was on the table outside his office at 1:14 p.m. He walked out of the building at 1:22 without it. Declan watched him go. There was no satisfaction in watching it, or not simple satisfaction anyway. There was something more complicated, the particular weight of a thing that was not finished, because an administrator handing over a badge was not a conclusion. It was a beginning of a process that would take time and legal machinery and careful documentation, and that process could still go wrong in ways that were not yet visible. He'd seen it go wrong before. He held that knowledge alongside the fact of the badge on the table and tried to feel appropriately neither too certain nor too relieved. He went upstairs to see Warren Tate. Tate was a compact man who looked like someone had assembled him from components designed for endurance, wide shoulders, short neck, the kind of face that had been weathered so long it had achieved a kind of geological stability. He was sitting up in bed with an oxygen cannula. He kept moving around like it was uncomfortable, which it was, and a tray of hospital food he had pushed to the edge of the table. He looked at Bravo first. His face did something uncomplicated and genuine when he saw the dog. "Rangers?" Declan said, because Tate's posture did not leave a lot of ambiguity. "What gave it away?" Tate said dryly. "Nothing specific." Declan sat in the visitor's chair. Bravo settled at his feet. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone ran me through a car wash from the inside." He looked at his hands. Doc said it was a clot. Said there was something in my chest from before. "Kandahar," Declan said. Tate looked at him. "You do your homework. There's a nurse who saved your life twice in 2 days," Declan said. "Once in the trauma room and once upstairs this morning. I wanted you to know that." Tate was quiet. The one Callum tried to kick out. Word traveled, "Yes. I heard the staff talking." He shifted the oxygen cannula again. "She military was. Combat medic, special operations attachment. Got erased from the record after an extraction that went wrong. Has been working here as a floor nurse for 7 years. Tate looked at the ceiling for a moment. He had the look of a man to whom this particular kind of story, the story of someone doing their job with total competence inside a system that was actively working against them, was not surprising, because he'd seen the shape of it many times in many configurations. "People like that," he said. "Ones who just keep going, even when the structure's rotten." He paused. "They're the reason the structure works at all." Declan didn't say anything. He thought Tate had put it about right. He was back on the first floor by 2:30, and Nadia was in the East Wing. Not on shift, she was still technically suspended. That process would take at least another 24 hours to formally reverse. But she was there, because the charge nurse had asked her about a medication interaction question, and she had come down to answer it, and had then stayed because the East Wing was where she knew how to be. She was sitting at the corner of the nurse's station, reviewing a chart that wasn't hers, because the charge nurse had asked her to look at it. and 2 other nurses were in the immediate vicinity, asking her questions and writing down what she said. No one had issued her a formal reversal. No one had handed her back her badge. She was just there, doing what she did, and the floor had arranged itself around that fact, with the practical acceptance of a working system recognizing competence and pulling it in. Declan watched that for a moment from the corridor entrance and thought about the 7 years she'd spent being precisely that: competent, quiet, arranged around, and the difference between the version where that was a mechanism of containment and the version where it might eventually become something else. Phone buzzed. Adjutant. He stepped into the alcove and answered. Vest's program office received the inquiry notice at 2 p.m., the adjutant said. They've been given 48 hours to produce the coordination files for Iron Corridor. And Vest's personal legal team contacted the IG's office at 2:17 to request a meeting. Challenge. A meeting. A pause with meaning in it. In my experience, when someone who's been protected for 9 years requests a meeting with investigators, they've done the math and decided cooperation is better than exposure. Going to talk, Declan said. That's my read, which meant the targeting error, the modified coordinates, the closed inquiry, all of it would come back into documentation. Named, timestamped, attributed. One more thing, the adjutant said. Okafor's office got a call an hour ago from Callum's lawyer. Already? Callum is trying to negotiate the framing of his cooperation. He's offering to provide full documentation of the contractor relationship in exchange for the board's inquiry being structured as an administrative review rather than a criminal referral. He wants a softer landing, Declan said. He wants any landing, the adjutant said. The board chair already declined. They're going criminal referral. His lawyer is now apparently calling anyone who'll pick up. A pause. Called Admiral Kessler 20 minutes ago. And Kessler declined to take the call. Declan stood in the alcove with that information for a moment, turning it over. Callum had spent 9 years building an arrangement that he believed was stable, that had multiple redundancies, that had survived every previous pressure applied to it. And in 72 hours, the redundancies had collapsed one by one, not because the people inside the arrangement had turned on each other, but because a dog had stopped walking in a hospital corridor, and a man who'd been carrying a burned photograph for 7 years had let the dog go. He was still standing there when Nadia appeared at the alcove entrance with her jacket over her arm and her bag over her shoulder, end of a day that was not technically her shift but had been her day regardless. Reyes is sending the formal suspension reversal to HR tonight, she said. I'm back on schedule Monday. Good. She looked at him. Not the controlled, layered look, the direct one, the one that had surfaced in the 4th floor room. What happens now? Now the process is run, he said. Vest cooperates. Callum's criminal referral moves through the system. The Iron Corridor file gets formally reopened with your report in the record. That takes time. Yes. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you go back to work Monday, he said. Come back Thursday for the support program orientation. She almost smiled. Almost. It got a little further than it had before. You were never actually interested in the support program. I'm interested now, he said. Tate's up there. He could use a familiar face from his service community. She looked toward the elevator bank in the direction of the 4th floor and the monitored recovery room and the man who'd had a fragment sitting in his chest in Kandahar because 4 previous physicians at this institution had missed it. I'll check on him before I leave, she said. He'd appreciate that. She moved toward the elevator. Bravo's ears tracked her. She pressed the call button and looked back, not at Declan, at the dog. He really remembered, she said. All this time? Yes, Declan said. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The door was 3 inches from closing when the fire alarm in the east wing activated not the full building alarm, the localized alert, the one that sounded in a specific zone for a specific reason, and the east wing floor registered it and moved. And at the same time, Declan's phone rang, his adjutant, and he picked up, already moving toward the source of the alert. The IG access request to Callum's archived files, the adjutant said. Someone with admin credentials remotely deleted a section of the administrative archive 8 minutes ago. The system flagged it as an anomalous access. Callum's credentials? A secondary admin account that hasn't been used in 3 years. The account is registered to... A pause. The account is registered to a former board member who resigned in 2021. His forwarding address at the time of resignation was a consulting group. Vest's subsidiary. Same holding entity, the adjutant confirmed. Someone inside this building used a dormant account to delete files from Callum's archive, which means whoever is doing it is either physically inside the building or has remote access to a machine that is. Declan looked at the east wing. The fire alert was resolving. It had been a localized sensor trigger in the supply room. Benign, the kind of thing that happened in older buildings, but the alert had cleared the east wing corridor for about 90 seconds. And 90 seconds was enough time for someone who knew the building's layout to move from one access test point to another without being observed. The elevator Nadia had stepped into had not opened on the 4th floor. Checked. The indicator above the elevator door showed it had stopped on the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor housed, among other things, the hospital's administrative server room. Declan moved. The 2nd floor was quieter than the East Wing administrative offices, records management, the hospital's IT infrastructure tucked into a side corridor behind a door that required badge access. Declan hit the stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator, took the stairs at a pace that was close to running but wasn't, and came out on the 2nd floor, landing in time to see the elevator doors opening at the far end of the corridor. Nadia stepped out. She was looking at her phone, and she saw him coming, and her expression moved from neutral to alert in about half a second. What happened? Someone accessed the administrative archive remotely and deleted files, he said, using a dormant account tied to Vest's subsidiary. The access was initiated from inside the building. He looked past her at the elevator. Stopped on this floor. The elevator stopped, she said. It wasn't my floor selection. The button panel registered 2, and the door opened. She turned and looked at the administrative corridor. I stepped out because the door opened. I was going to take the next car up. He believed her. It also meant the elevator had been called to the 2nd floor by someone who needed it to stop here, creating a gap, a 90-second window when the corridor between the East Wing and the administrative records access point was clear. The server room, he said. Down there, she said, already moving. Through the IT corridor. You need a level 2 badge. Do you have level 2 access? No. I have East Wing access. IT coordinator on this floor is Pete. Pete, who knew the nursing schedule by heart and had given Declan Nadia's name 48 hours ago in a conversation that had seemed incidental and turned out to be the first domino in a sequence that had brought them to this exact moment. The particular circularity of it was not lost on Declan. They found Pete at his desk in the IT support office, headphones around his neck, a sandwich in his hand, looking up at the access log on his screen with the expression of someone who has noticed something anomalous and has not yet decided what to do with it. Someone's in the server room, Pete said when he saw them. He said it like a statement that had been waiting for the right audience. Access log shows a badge entry 7 minutes ago, but I'm the only IT staff on this floor today, and I've been at my desk since noon. He looked at his badge, which was on the desk next to his sandwich. My badge was in my drawer for an hour while I was in a meeting downstairs. Declan and Nadia exchanged a look. Can you pull up the server room camera? Declan said. Pete turned to his monitor and clicked through 2 screens and pulled up the internal camera feed for the server room, a small, climate-controlled space lined with rack units and patch panels, and they stood behind Pete and looked at the figure on the screen. The figure was a man, late 60s, gray-haired, in a suit jacket, and he was at the administrative archive terminal, with his back to the camera. His posture was not the posture of someone in a hurry. He was methodical, deleting with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Nadia said very quietly, "That's Kessler." Declan did not move for 2 full seconds. He processed it, the shape of it, the logic of it, the way it reframed everything Kessler had said in the consultation room, with the unhurried revision of someone standing at a whiteboard, erasing one set of conclusions and writing in another. Kessler had brought the restoration document. Kessler had come because Callum called him. Kessler had given them the targeting error information, the contractor chain, the name Harlan Vest. And Kessler had given them all of it at precisely the moment when the IG's inquiry was already moving, when the files were already being pulled, when his cooperation cost him nothing that wasn't already going to be exposed, except the specific files he was now, on camera, in the process of removing. He's not deleting Callum's records, Declan said. No, Nadia said. She was already reading the same conclusion. Deleting his own. Declan called Reyes. She answered in one ring. He told her what the camera showed. There was a pause on her end that was about 3 seconds long and contained, he suspected, fairly concentrated quantity of controlled frustration at having had a cooperative admiral in the room for 2 hours who had been playing a longer game than any of them had read. "Can Pete lock the server room from outside?" she asked. Declan looked at Pete, who had heard the question and was already nodding and reaching for his keyboard. "Yes," Declan said. "Do it," Ray said. "I'm on my way up. Don't go in until I'm there." Pete locked the server room. On the monitor, Kessler stopped typing. He turned and looked at the door. He tried his badge. The light stayed red. He stood for a moment with his badge in his hand, looking at the locked door, and his posture went through an adjustment that was not panic, he was too experienced for panic, but was the adjustment of a man who had just run out of the particular kind of time he'd been managing. He sat down in the chair in front of the terminal and waited. Declan watched him do it and thought about the document. The Restoration. 8 months. Kessler had prepared it 8 months ago and carried it and had not sent it, and the reason he'd given that Marsh starting to pull the thread was what moved him was probably partly true. But the fuller version was that Kessler had prepared the Restoration as a chip, a gesture of cooperation that he could produce at the right moment to establish his position as a person who had done something right in a room where the thing he'd done wrong was about to come out. He'd read the situation correctly and had timed his entrance carefully. What he hadn't accounted for was the elevator stopping on the second floor, or Pete's sandwich, or the fact that the access log on an unmanned IT terminal would be visible on a screen that 2 people happened to be standing behind. Small things. The spaces between planned events where the unplanned ones lived. Reyes arrived on the second floor 4 minutes later with Okafor on the phone, and the server room door opened. Kessler stood up from the chair with the measured composure of a man surrendering a position he'd calculated was no longer worth holding, which was a different thing from remorse, and they all understood that. "What did you delete?" Reyes asked him. 2 communication files, he said, from the Iron Corridor planning period. They documented my awareness of the targeting modification prior to the operation launch. The corridor was very quiet. "You knew," Nadia said. He looked at her. "I knew there had been a modification. I didn't know what it would produce. I was told it was a correction to a prior error, not—" He stopped. "That's a distinction I've had 9 years to decide how much weight to give." "She almost died," Declan said. 2 other operators almost died. "The whole extraction." "I know," Kessler said. "I know what it produced. And you buried her report because her report would have led to your communication files," Nadia said. Her voice was very flat, not raised. Flat in the way a surface is flat when every irregularity has been compressed out of it. That's why the file disappeared in 72 hours. Not because of the operation's classification. Because of you. Kessler did not deny it. The IT corridor of the second floor of Callaway Veterans Medical Center held that silence for a moment, and Reyes was documenting, and Okafor was listening on the phone, and Pete was standing very still at his desk with his forgotten sandwich and his access logs. And in the middle of all of it, Nadia stood, with her damaged hand at her side, and her bag still over her shoulder, and the restoration document still in her jacket pocket. And she looked at the man who had signed her erasure, and she did not say anything else. She didn't need to. The shape of what he'd done was fully visible now, in a corridor with institutional lighting and witnesses, and an active phone line to the Inspector General's office. He couldn't revise it. He couldn't soften it. The files he'd deleted were reconstructable from backup servers. Reyes established that within the hour and his presence in the server room and the deletion attempt would themselves become part of the evidentiary record, which was the particular irony of trying to erase things in the digital age. The attempt became evidence of the knowledge. Kessler was escorted from the building at 4:12 p.m. He did not say anything on the way out. He walked with the posture of a man who had made his calculations and lost them, and understood that the processing of that loss was going to be long, and was going to happen somewhere other than this corridor. Nadia watched him go. Then she looked at Declan, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was a category of ending that is not triumphant, that is simply true, and heavy, and necessary, and this was one of those, and they both understood it. It took 11 days. 11 days for the IG's inquiry to formally complete its preliminary phase. 11 days for the criminal referral on Callum to be officially filed with the federal prosecutor's office, and for Harlan Vest's cooperation agreement to be signed, and for the Naval Review Board to convene the session that would formally restore Lieutenant Nadia Roussel's service record to the active archive, with her report from Iron Corridor reinstated as a filed and credible document. Vest's cooperation had been complete, and in the way of cooperating witnesses, who understood that the depth of their confession affected the terms of their arrangement, exhaustive. He named names. He provided transaction records. He produced the internal communication that showed the targeting modification had not been a system error, but a deliberate adjustment made to redirect operational heat away from an asset. His program was running in the same geographic zone, and adjustment that he had known put the Iron Corridor team at elevated risk and had made anyway, because the asset was worth more to him than the risk assessment. That document, when it reached Okafor's desk, produced a stillness in her office that her adjutant described later as the specific quiet of someone sitting with an anger they are consciously choosing not to perform. Kessler entered a cooperation agreement of his own 6 days after his escort from the building. His awareness of the targeting modification was documented. His role in the erasure of Nadia's file was documented. His preparation of the restoration document, the chip he'd carried for 8 months, was included in the record as evidence of premeditated awareness of his own culpability. He would not face criminal charges because the cooperation agreement precluded that, but his name would be in the permanent record of the inquiry, and the permanent record would not be classified. Callum's case moved more slowly, as criminal referrals do, but it moved. The financial connection between his board appointment and Vest's subsidiary was formally established. Correspondence from his staff member, the one who had decided, in the moment Reyes appeared with a document case, that cooperation was better than loyalty, contained enough to sustain the referral. His professional medical certifications were suspended pending the outcome, which meant that Callaway Veterans Medical Center's board began the process of identifying a new chief of trauma services, process that the staff of the East Wing learned about and received in the particular way that news is received when it confirms something a large number of people have been waiting to confirm for a long time without allowing themselves to say it out loud. Nadia was back on shift by day 3. Her badge was at her station. Her schedule was her schedule. The East Wing moved around her the way the East Wing always had, except that the quality of the arrangement had changed, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the incremental way of a floor, adjusting to the understanding that the nurse who had always been the most competent person in the room was also the person who had, while that room was not paying attention, held the line on something that mattered. Warren Tate was discharged on day 4. He stopped at the nurses' station on the way out and stood in front of Nadia with his duffel bag over one shoulder and the particular awkwardness of a man who was better with action than with the language of gratitude. And he said, "I heard what you went through to be standing in that room when I needed someone in that room." Nadia said, "You would have done the same." "Probably," he said. "Doesn't make it less." He left his contact information with the charge nurse. He did not make it sentimental. He just left it, which was the kind of thing a person did when they wanted to say, "I'm still here," without making a production of it. On the 11th day, Declan drove back to the naval base. He'd been staying at the lodging facility, coming back to Callaway on the days that required his presence, the review board session, a formal deposition for the IG's record, Thursday support program orientation. He had promised to attend and had attended, sitting in a circle of veterans with Bravo at his feet and talking about the specific difficulty of carrying things alone for years and what it cost. And on the other days he'd been making calls, driving, thinking. Stopped at the hospital on the way out of the city. Nadia was finishing a shift. She came out through the side entrance at 6:43 in her civilian jacket. Same bag, no scrubs, which meant she'd already changed, which meant she'd known approximately when he'd be there, which he noted without comment. They walked to the park. The same path, the gravel still holding puddles from a rain 2 days earlier. Bravo moved between them at a pace that was, for a retired military working dog, something very close to a saunter. "Diaz called me," Nadia said. "I heard. How was it?" "Strange," she said. "Good. Mostly strange." He didn't remember as much as I did from that night, which was I don't know. Expected him to have the same version. He had a different one. She was quiet for a moment. "He remembered your voice. Not mine," he said. "He followed your voice out." "I was barely conscious," Declan said. "People remember what they need to remember," she said. "It's not always accurate, and it doesn't have to be." He thought about the burned photograph. the partial face. The way he'd built a story around an absence for 7 years, and the story had both matched and not matched the actual person he'd found. He thought about the word he'd said in the park, the one she'd used with Bravo, the one that wasn't in any protocol, and the 2 seconds she'd stood with her eyes closed after he said it. Full weight of 7 years pressing through 2 seconds of stillness. The support program coordinator, he said. Voss. She asked if I knew anyone with a clinical background who'd be interested in developing a veteran trauma module. Something specifically for people coming out of high classification service with complicated medical and psychological histories. Nadia walked a few steps. She's asking me. She's not asking you yet. I'm asking if you'd want to be asked. She looked at the path ahead of them. The dog walked. The gravel was wet, and the evening was cold, and the park lights were coming on, one by one in the November dark. I'm a floor nurse, she said. You're a combat-trained medic with a clinical nursing license, 7 years of veteran care experience, and a first-hand understanding of what it costs to come back from something the record pretends didn't happen, Declan said. The floor nurse part is one part of the list. She didn't answer immediately. He waited. I'd want to keep the clinical work, she said finally. I'm not moving into program administration. That she stopped. That's not where I'm useful. I didn't say administration. Developing a module. Clinical curriculum. You'd still be on the floor. You've thought about this. I've had 11 days, he said. Think about things. She almost smiled. All the way this time. It wasn't broad, it wasn't the kind of smile that made a production of itself, but it was complete. And it was the first one he'd seen from her that was, and he thought about everything she had survived to be standing in this park, smiling in the cold, and felt something he didn't have a precise name for, but that had the texture of something earned. Tell Voss to ask me, Nadia said. Bravo stopped in the middle of the path and sat down, and both of them nearly walked into him. He turned and looked at Nadia with the full, unambiguous expectation of a dog who understood that stops had purposes. She crouched down. She put both hands on either side of his face, the damaged right, the undamaged left, and he pressed his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. And she stayed like that for a moment in the circle of the park light, with the cold November dark around her, and the dog's quiet weight against her hands. We're okay, she said, to him specifically, in the low register of something private. We're okay now. Bravo's tail moved once, slowly. Then again, she stood up. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later, in a session of the Naval Review Board that was not public and was not theatrical. It was a room with a table and documents, and people who used careful, precise language to describe what had been done and what was being corrected. Nadia sat at the table in civilian clothes, the same jacket, with Declan to her left, and Okafor at the head of the table. The document that restored Lieutenant Roussel to the active record was signed. The report she had filed 7 years ago, the targeting error, the pattern, the flagged anomaly that had started all of it, was formally entered into the Iron Corridor inquiry record as a credible filed document that had been improperly suppressed. No one in that room made a speech. Nadia signed her name at the bottom of the restoration document. Her name, her full name, both of them, because she had decided after 11 days of considering it that she was not choosing between them. She was Nadia Roussel-Varas, because both of those names had survived something, and she had built something in each of them, and she was not interested in erasing any version of herself that had made it through. She put the pen down. Okafor looked at her across the table. For the record, the Admiral said, the report you filed was the document that made the targeting error traceable. Without it, the communication chain stays buried. Without the communication chain, there's no cooperation from Vest, no financial connection to Callum, no mechanism for the IG's inquiry to reach Kessler. She paused. You filed that report alone, at 29, in a recovery facility in Germany, with a compromised hand and no institutional support. And then you held it for 7 years while the people responsible for burying it operated without consequence. Another pause. The record will reflect that. Nadia said nothing for a moment. Then the record should also reflect Tate and Diaz and Wakefield, the patients in the East Wing who didn't have advocates, the ones who came back from things that didn't get documented correctly and ended up in a system that didn't know what to do with them. She looked at Okafor steadily. I want the module to address that specifically. The gap between military medical record and civilian care. Veterans falling through it. Okafor looked at her. That's a policy proposal. I'm aware. It would require a formal partnership between the Naval Medical Oversight Office and Callaway's civilian administration. I'm aware of that too. A pause. Okafor almost smiled. I'll have someone reach out to Voss. Callum's case resolved 14 months later, the federal conviction on 2 counts of conspiracy to defraud under government contracting statutes and 1 count of witness intimidation, last related to the administrative suspension he had imposed on Nadia in the direct context of the IG's inquiry. He lost his medical license. He served time. He was not the first person in an institutional position to use the apparatus of that institution against the people it was built to serve, and he would not be the last, and the specific tragedy of that fact was something Nadia thought about without resolution, because some things don't resolve, they just become part of the landscape you move through. Harlan Vest's cooperation agreement resulted in the dissolution of his program's operational contracts and a civil settlement that, by design, would never make the news. His name existed in the record. That would have to be enough. And whether it was or not was not a question Nadia spent much time on, because the questions she had energy for were the ones she could do something with. Kessler lived with his cooperation agreement and his name in a document that would not be classified, which was the kind of consequence that was invisible from the outside and not invisible from the inside. And she understood that without excusing it, because those were 2 different things, and she had learned to hold them separately. The Veteran Trauma Module, launched 9 months after the restoration, was not elegant. The curriculum took 4 drafts and a significant argument with 3 hospital administrators about clinical scope, and the first cohort of 8 veterans produced 1 outstanding outcome, 3 complicated ones, and 4 that were still in process, which Nadia described to Declan over coffee as exactly what progress looks like from inside it, as opposed to how it looks in retrospect. Declan came to the launch. So did Tate, who had become, in the months since his discharge, one of the module's informal peer supporters, not a clinical role, just a man who showed up and sat with people who needed someone to sit with them, which was not a small thing, and he understood it wasn't. Bravo came too. He was 10 now. He moved a little more slowly than he had in the East Wing corridor on that first morning, and he had developed a preference for the left side of whatever room he was in. And on cold days his shoulder, the one with the scar, was stiff in the mornings and took time to work out. He was fine. He was the specific fine of a living creature that has survived the things it survived, and carries them honestly in its body, and is not diminished by them. He went straight to Nadia when they walked in, and she crouched down and put her hands on his face, and he pressed his forehead to hers, the same way he had in the park in November. She had stopped, being surprised that he remembered. Some things remember what they need to remember. Not always accurately, not always completely, but with a fidelity that has nothing to do with documentation, and everything to do with what the thing meant at the time it happened. Later, when the formal part of the launch was over, and the room had loosened into the informal gathering of people who had been through something together and were trying to figure out the language for the other side of it, Declan stood next to Nadia at the edge of the room, and she looked at the people in it, the veterans in various stages of whatever they were working through, the nursing staff who had volunteered their time, the program coordinator who had fought for the budget, Tate in the corner talking to a younger man who looked like he hadn't decided yet whether being in this room was a good idea, and she said, without looking at Declan, almost to herself, "It's not enough." He knew what she meant. "No," he said. "There are more Tates, more East Wings, more records that got consolidated." She paused. "This module covers 8 people. The gap covers thousands." "Yes." So she exhaled. "We keep going." It was not a grand statement. It was not the kind of thing that gets remembered as a turning point. It was just a person who had spent 7 years in a borrowed name, in a hospital that was supposed to be her hiding place and turned out to be her arena, deciding in a room full of imperfect progress that the work wasn't finished and that she wasn't finished either. She looked at Bravo, who was sitting at the feet of the young man in the corner, while Tate talked to him, not performing anything, just present, the way well-trained dogs were present, without agenda or condition. The young man had his hand on the dog's back, and he was not looking at Tate, but he was listening. His shoulders had dropped about half an inch from where they'd been when he walked in. Half an inch, in a room of 8 people, on the first day of something that would take years. That was what it looked like from inside. Nadia had spent 7 years waiting for someone to finally see her, And the thing she was slowly understanding had been understanding incrementally since the moment she stepped forward with a needle in a trauma room and stopped asking the institution's permission, was that being seen was not the destination. It was what happened when you stopped making yourself small enough to survive and started taking up the space your competence actually required. The invisible nurse, the erased lieutenant, the woman who rebuilt herself in the gap between who the record said she was and who she knew herself to be. She had not been waiting. She had been working. And the difference between those two things, between survival as passivity and survival as a form of resistance, was the thing she would spend the rest of her working life trying to teach to anyone who needed it. Bravo looked up at her from across the room. She nodded at him, the way you nod at someone who has been with you long enough that words are beside the point. He put his chin back down on his paws, and the room continued imperfect. In process, not enough. And more than nothing, the way real things continue, which is without ceremony, one day at a time, in the direction of something better than what came before.